All right, everyone. Well, welcome to chapter 14, the chapter on the heart and the physics of blood flow. We'll be going over the physics of blood flow quite a bit over the next few chapters, and also talking about the heart. And what's interesting about the heart is that many cultures throughout history have viewed it as the seat of the soul, and they believe that the heart encompassed the person. And you can kind of understand why they would think that, because if you have a person and you take away the heart, the person stops working and the animal. However, we know now that the heart does not encompass the person, it's really the brain. I guess an analogy would be a, I don't know why this is coming to my head, but a Game Boy. If you take the batteries out of the Game Boy, it's not going to work anymore because it has nothing to give energy. But the real Game Boy is going to be in the circuitry. Well, the heart is a pump. It is a very good pump. It keeps the person or animal working because it circulates blood. Recall that all 60 trillion cells in our body, give or take a couple, require nutrients, a constant flow of nutrients and essential gases like oxygen. It also needs a place to dump in the waste products so they can be expelled. That movement is driven by the hearts. So the heart is incredibly important, as I'm sure you did not need me to tell you that. So the heart is a pump, but recall that the only functional units in biology are proteins. And proteins, as we talked about with muscle, contractile proteins work by contracting. So we don't have something like a mechanical pump that is continuously flowing at a constant pace. The heart works in bursts, but it can't really work like that exactly either, because blood flow would be incredibly turbulent in our body. We don't want that. We want blood flow to be relatively consistent. And we'll talk about what anatomical adaptation results in that. Anyways, let's go ahead and draw our heart. If you don't learn anything else today, you can at least draw a heart and impress people at cocktail parties. So we're going to start with these two chambers here. And don't worry, I'll go back and label this. But these two chambers are called the ventricles. And the ventricles' job is to store blood so they can be pumped out either to the lungs or to the system. And we're going to draw some cardiac muscle. And you'll see here on the right side, because recall in anatomy, we always kind of base it off a mirror image. If you look at the cardiac muscle here, you'll see that the left side of the heart, so I'll label this right and left, the left side of the heart has much thicker myocardium, as they call it. And that's because the left side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood all throughout the body, whereas the right side of the heart has the luxury of just pumping blood to the lungs. Now, the heart on the left ventricle expels blood at a tremendous amount of pressure. I think right at the heart is something like at least 200 millimeters per mercury per contraction. I think the right ventricle is like 30 millimeters of mercury per second. I have to fact check those, but I think it's something like that. So the left side of the heart definitely exerts much more force than the right side of the heart. And if we look here, the heart is going to have some valves. And I'm going to go ahead and draw the valves in dark red. There's actually two valves. These are called the semilunar valves because they look like a half moon. And I'm going to draw arteries in pink. Let's go ahead and do that. We have a very large artery here. This large artery is called the aorta. Now, this isn't to scale, but it's the largest artery in the body. We also have some other valves that we call atrioventricular valves because they separate the two chambers of the heart, the atrium and the ventricles. And these are held in place by what's called the chorda tendineae. which are actually one of the few skeletal muscles in the body that are non-contractile. They just serve to hold the valves in place. Okay, now what I'm going to draw here, I'm going to draw some other vessels. Actually, I promise I draw them in pink, but it might take me a little bit. So this is one vessel. Actually, let me go back and draw the veins in a different color. What we're actually doing now is we're drawing veins. I'm just going to go ahead and draw this entire thing in blue just to save myself some agony here. All right, so over here we have veins. Now, one thing I do want to note is that not all veins carry deoxygenated blood. There seems to be a widespread belief that that's the case. Understandably, because basically every vein in the body carries deoxygenated blood. Except for these veins here. They are called pulmonary veins, and they return oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart. All right, now let's focus our attention to the right side of the heart. We have another pair of arteries, and these are actually called the pulmonary arteries. As I said, I'll go back and label these. So the pulmonary arteries. And then we're going to have the largest vein in the body here, called the vena cava. There's actually a superior aspect, which I'll draw here, and an inferior aspect, which I'll draw here. We call this the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, not because one is better than the other. Recall the anatomy. Superior is on top, inferior is on the bottom. And we also have another valve here. This is another atrioventricular valve. And go just like this. And let me make sure I got this all good. Yep, so let's go ahead and label things now. This here is the left ventricle. I'm just going to label one side. The left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood to system. Meanwhile, the right ventricle, and I'm not going to describe everything here, but the ventricles are really important. They pump deoxygenated blood. This is the right ventricle. To the lungs. Very important job, of course. Now we also have here the two semilunar valves. This one is actually called the bicuspid valve or mitral valve. And this is what is going to separate the atria and the ventricles. One thing to keep in mind is that the bicuspid valve default position is open. And it is going to be like this. So this is the default position of the valve. It's actually going to be open so blood can just passively go through. Now, we'll talk about this with the cardiac cycle, but when the heart becomes pressurized, what's going to happen is that this blood is going to force the ventricles to close. That's true with both of these valves, both the bicuspid and then this one here is called the tricuspid valve. Now this valve here is going to be called the pulmonary valve. And this is going to separate the ventricles from the pulmonary artery. And this here is called the aortic valve. And this is going to separate the left ventricle from the aorta. And like I said, these are the semilunar valves. So these semilunar valves, their default position is actually closed. And the reason why they are closed is because on top of these valves sits blood. And if it wasn't for these valves being closed, the blood would move back into the ventricles, which of course we do not want because we want blood to flow in a one-way pattern. Now, these valves can be forced open in this direction here. So this is their default position, but they can also swing open like this if there's sufficient force. So with the AV valves, you need force to close them. With the SL valves, you need force to open them. And that will make sense in a bit. Okay, now we have these set of veins here. There's two sets of veins. This one is called the pulmonary vein, sorry. It's like, I knew they were called pulmonary veins, but it just didn't sound right for a moment. Do you guys ever get that feeling? It's like you see a word and you say, you know what, that word can't be spelled correctly, but it is. You just, for whatever reason, forgot for a second that it was spelled like that. Or maybe that's a me problem, I don't know. So pulmonary veins are the only veins in the body that return oxygenated blood to hearts. Really, the textbook definition of a vein is it returns blood to the heart. Textbook definition of an artery moves blood away from the heart. But the pulmonary veins are one exception. They return oxygenated blood to the left atrium specifically. And these, of course, are the pulmonary. This is the vena cava. We have inferior and superior aspects, and they return deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. Now here we have the pulmonary arteries. Running out of room here, so I'm going to have to erase soon. So we have the pulmonary arteries, and these are going to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs. These are some of the only arteries in the body that pump deoxygenated blood. Almost every other artery in the body, like the aorta, pumps oxygenated blood. Okay, chordae tendineae, not drawn here. Try and draw them as closely as I can in a two-dimensional pattern. As I said, these keep the valves taut, I guess you can say. All right, so it looks like we have most of the heart labeled and put down. Oh, and also the atriums, I don't think I mentioned them yet. So briefly, the atrium. So the right atrium, sorry, this is the left, apologies. I'm off my game again. So yeah, the left atrium receives deoxygenated blood. And then the right atrium receives oxygenated blood. Apologies, deoxygenated blood. Told you I'm off my game. Deoxygenated blood. Yep, I am totally off my game. Left atrium receives oxygenated blood. All right, so let me go back and fix my fast error. teaches me that I should not try and think too far ahead. I was already thinking of my next diagram, which I was excited about. Left atrium receives oxygenated blood, and the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood. If you caught that as I was talking about it, then congratulations, you get a gold star for this part of the lecture. All right, right on. So now what about the direction of blood flow in the heart? Well, we have another diagram for that. Going to once again draw for you a heart. This heart's going to be a little bit simpler and a little bit smaller. So we have the left ventricle, try and label it along with me. And I'm going to draw things a bit differently this time. I'm not going to have as much detail. All right, we have the AV valves. This is the tricuspid, that is the bicuspid. And I'm just going to draw here one pulmonary vein, like so. And then I'm going to draw a very modified vena cava. And let me go ahead and extend this heart here. Give me a second. We are going to have a very large aorta like this. We're going to have a very large pulmonary artery like this. Okay, so now we have a very large, very modified heart. Let me go ahead, because we're going to actually be needing a lot of room here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this a little bit out like this. Kind of looks like a jester's hat, at least I think. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to make a circuit. And this is going to be the left side of the heart. It's going to end up going to the system, the body system. So I'm going to draw the square here, and this is going to be the system of the body. System just means all throughout the body. Anything that needs to receive blood is the system. Now this box here is going to represent the lungs. Because recall that deoxygenated blood needs to go through the lungs in order to become oxygenated. The lungs is the site of gas exchange. All right, now recall this is a circuit, so we need to complete it. So we are going to loop back here to go back to the left side of the heart. And we're going to loop back here to go through the right side of the heart. Let's see if I can get this on the first try. This one always kind of flummoxes me, but I think I might actually have gotten it. All right, radical. So now we have our circuit. So this tells you anything, is that the cardiovascular system is a closed circuit. Which is why I was saying, I think in one of the lectures, that whenever you see in a movie somebody coughing up blood, that is just I guess, the Hollywood constant for when somebody's really hurt bad, because you should not be coughing up blood unless you have something wrong with the lungs. Now that doesn't mean you cannot internally bleed. Yes, you can, and that's extremely serious. I believe a condition called an aortic aneurysm, which is where the aorta actually bursts open, has a mortality rate of like 90%. So yes, you can bleed internally, just coughing up the blood. That seems to be the disconnect, as we can say. So it is a closed circuit. Since it's a closed circuit, it means you can start anywhere on the circuit and make a complete loop. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the left side of the heart. which I'm going to color oxygenated blood in red. So we know that oxygenated blood is going to return to the heart through the pulmonary veins. So it's going to end up in the left atrium. Then going to go down to the right ventricle, left ventricle, sorry. So pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, and then it's going to loop around and go into the aorta. It's going to travel down the aorta, and it is going to go into the system, meaning all throughout the body. Now, as this blood goes through the system, it's going to become more and more deoxygenated because cells are going to take the oxygen from the blood and they are going to return carbon dioxide. Deoxygenated blood looks a little bit darker red, but since every textbook listed as blue, that's what I'm going to draw it in, is blue. Why blue? Well, some people think that if you look at your wrist, you'll see that the veins look blue. They're not actually blue, it just is the color contrast between the dark red blood and your, I guess you can say, peach color skin. That contrast makes it look kind of blue. So as I said, since every textbook kind of listed as blue, that's what I'll go with. So by the time the blood goes through your system, it's going to become more and more deoxygenated. And it's going to be returned through the venous movement of our body. And it's now going to go back to the heart, to the right heart, through the vena cava. From the vena cava, it's going to go into the right atrium, then the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to go back to the pulmonary arteries, and it is going to go to the lungs. The lungs are the site of gas exchange, and as it goes through the lungs, it's going to be rapidly oxygenated. And then it is going to go back to the pulmonary veins, back to the left atrium and the left ventricle. All right, everyone, so now we're going to go through the direction of blood flow in the heart. It's actually my second time recording this because the first time I made about 400 errors. And if I did not redo this, then you would have been doing so much erasing that probably would buy stock, whatever company makes erasers, because you'd be buying so many. You're going to use them all on my mistake. So recall that the cardiovascular system is a closed circuit. So we literally can start anywhere in the circuit and loop around. To keep things simple, I'm going to start with the left atrium. And through the left atrium, blood is going to go down through the bicuspid valve. And it is going to go through into the left ventricle. Through the left ventricle, it is going to go through a valve called the aortic valve. And it is going to go into the system. The system is everything, every cell in the body that requires oxygenated blood and nutrients. Now from the system, it is going to loop around and it is going to go into the vena cava. From the vena cava, it is going to go through the tricuspid valve, and it is going to go into the right. See, I keep making mistakes. It's going to go through the vena cava, through the, into the right atrium. Then it is going to go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, which is here. From the right ventricle, it is going to go through the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery, it is going to go through the lungs, where it's going to be rapidly deoxygenated. From the lungs, it is going to go to the pulmonary veins, I can fix this end, and it is going back into the left atrium. So as I said, you can start at any point in the circuit, and you can loop back around because, as I said, blood flow through the body is in a closed circuit. And it requires the arteries and veins, of course, being intact and being able to flow blood properly. There's plenty of conditions where either the arteries or veins are not as flexible anymore or have some other problems where blood is not able to travel as well. Think of it as a freeway system. If one part of the freeway has a lot of potholes in it and is hard to drive on, that's going to be your limiting point. Or if you drive to Santa Barbara often, you'll see that there's a section of Carpinteria, I think it is. I know they're trying to fix it, where traffic goes down to 2 lanes. It doesn't matter that the rest of the freeway has 3 or even 4 lanes, but that one part is the limiting factor. So it's very important that the cardiovascular system is healthy, because if there's this one area that is dysfunctional, it will stop everything, or at least highly impede it. So left atrium goes through the bicuspid valve, goes through the it goes into the left ventricle, then through the aortic valve and through the aorta. So when it goes through the system, return through the vena cava to the right atrium, passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, goes through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries. From the pulmonary arteries, it goes to the lungs, then it goes back through the pulmonary veins. That is the direction of blood flow through the heart. Okay, everyone, now for this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about the physics of blood flow, or more or less, what is the driving force behind the movement of blood in our body. And it goes through the idea that the heart is going to be a pump. So I'm going to draw the heart as kind of a square looking thing here. And let's go with a rectangle. So this is the actual heart that is signifying the pump. And then we are going to have this as the arterial system. So the heart is going to be the pump. But what the heart does is it is going to generate pressure measured by millimeters of mercury. So it is going to exert pressure. We'll just go with an arbitrary value of about 180 millimeters of mercury. That is the measurement of pressure as it leaves the ventricles in this situation. So let's talk about pressure first. And pressure is defined as force against container walls. Probably the best example of this is going to be a balloon. You blow up a balloon, you are pressurizing the walls by adding air. So what happens is that the air that you add is going to push against the walls and thus creating pressure. So pressure is simply force against container walls, and it needs to be in a closed system. You cannot pressurize an open system. That's the problem, is if the closed cardiovascular system breaks somewhere, is that you will not be able to contain as much pressure. Blood flow will stop, and of course will go toward the path of least resistance out of the vessel. Now let's talk about a pressure gradient here. A pressure gradient, of course, we know that a gradient is difference between 2 points. And might be starting to make sense now why I said that on the first day. Physiology is basically gradients and surface area to volume. Gradients are a huge part of understanding physiology. So difference between 2 points. And that's because, for example, we'll say that at this point here, blood is being ejected from the heart at a pressure of 180 millimeters of mercury. I'll say it's going to be 175 here. And we'll say that at this point here, point B, it's going to be 125 millimeters of mercury. So what is the net here? What is the net difference? The net difference is going to be 50 millimeters of mercury. So this is going to be the net difference. So let us put down here 50 millimeters of mercury. That is going to be the net flow throughout the body, the difference between 2 points. If the difference is greater, then the net flow will be higher. Now, why is it that we have lost pressure as we've gone down the arterial system? And the answer has to do with a concept called friction. Let's see where I can write this. Write it up here. Friction. Friction is more or less Physics 101, and friction is a form of resistance. So friction is a form of resistance, and resistance opposes flow. It is a form of resistance. There's several parts of resistance that we are going to talk about, and friction is one of the aspects. So friction is resistance, and it opposes flow. As we see here, there is resistance caused by the vessel walls, and that is going to slow down the velocity of blood as it leaves the main pump. So the closer the artery is to the heart, then the greater the pressure will be. Okay. Now we are going to talk about the idea of fluid pressure. So I'm going to clear this here. And one aspect that is going to be very important is something called hydrostatic pressure. Hydro means water, static means to stay the same. So it is called hydrostatic pressure. And how this is defined is, it is, at least in the cardiovascular system, sort of a simple way to put it is that it is a form of potential energy. As you know, potential energy is energy that can be converted to kinetic energy. So what's going to happen, and the cardiovascular system is dependent on hydrostatic pressure. This is going to be the heart. We know that the heart, when it contracts, we call that systole. So during systole, we are going to have a contraction. Now, when this occurs, blood, I guess choosing red for blood is not going to be a good idea since I just drew the vessels in red. The blood is going to leave the heart, and it is going to flow through the tube. but not in a way that you think. Whenever anything flows through a tube, it's actually trying to escape through all angles. So it is not just going forward. Some of it is going to push against the walls as well. This is also going to be a form of resistance. Because what's going to happen here is that the fluid is going to try to push against the wall, but if the tube is too rigid, it's not going to flex it at all. It's not going to bend it. This energy will be lost. So if the tube is inflexible, energy will be lost. That's not what we want. However, if you remember from anatomy, that is not the case, because arteries are made up of a substance called elastin that is designed to flex. It is designed to store pressure. So arteries, by their very nature, arteries are what we call a pressure reservoir, meaning that they're able to store pressure. So how would this look like in another model if we had flexible arteries? Well, the second half of this vessel, I'll show you as what would happen if this tube could store energy. And it is going to look like this. Let me see the best way to do it. I'll go ahead and draw it on the bottom here. All right, so now I'm going to show you model B, which is going to have flexible arteries. So purple will be model B. So we have blood that is going to once again move through the tube and hit all angles. However, this is going to be the end result. You're going to see that instead of the energy being lost as it hits against the wall, instead it's going to be stored. The energy is going to be stored in the walls. The energy is going to be used to stretch the walls. I guess if any of you have ever been to those trampoline places, there's a side that's like a trampoline wall. If you jump into that trampoline wall, first it is going to absorb your pressure, then it's going to spring back, and it's going to propel you. It's actually a lot of fun. So what happens during systole? So this is what happens during systole. What's going to happen is that the heart is going to contract, blood is going to be sent in all different directions, and it is going to stretch the walls of the arteries. And during diastole, it's going to look like this. Let me draw it in the example above. So in diastole, which is when the heart is in a state of relaxation, which guess what, is about 2/3 of the time, it is going to look like this. Going to relax, and blood is going to go forward like this. Now, why is this important? It is important because it is going to ensure even blood flow. So that happens during systole. Is blood is going to move in all directions, including forward. I don't know if I illustrated that well enough. So blood is going to move in all directions, including forward. And during diastole, then it is going to relax because there's no more driving force, and it is going to, and the pressure stored in the arterial walls is going to release and continue to propel the blood forward. Now, when you've gone to the doctor, you've gotten what's called a systolic reading and diastolic reading. And the diastolic reading, that is more or less the pressure that is generated as the walls of the artery release. So of course, the more pressure that's stored in the walls, then the higher the diastolic pressure will be. So of course, you don't want that number to be high, because that means that your arteries are being really stretched. You take a balloon and keep on stretching it, eventually it's going to slacken. All right, and now we're going to go to our next part, which is going to be, give me a second here, is going to be resistance factors. So what are the factors that mainly cause resistance against arterial flow? And two of them are going to be, well, I'll explain in a bit. But anyways, this is called Poiseuille's law, but I just call these resistance factors. So we know that friction is one, but what are the other factors? Well, one is going to be viscosity. Viscosity is more or less thickness of blood. If something is very viscous, it's very thick. In the human body, viscosity is not really a factor, because our body is so good at regulating homeostasis that really it's pretty good at maintaining normal viscosity of blood. Only thing that can really affect it would be excessive lipids in the blood. That can actually cause the blood to be more viscous. That is not what you want. So anyways, the greater the viscosity, then the greater resistance. The greater the resistance, the less the flow. Now, as I said, this is not really a factor in normal physiological situations. Next is length. So the length of all the vessels in the system. So I guess you can call this, I guess it's analogous to square feet. So I'll just put down amount of tubing in cardiovascular system. So if somebody is very tall, they're going to have more vessel length than someone who's very short, and thus they are going to have more resistance against blood flow. So to show you here, the greater the length, the greater the resistance, and of course, the less the flow. However, there is a factor that is constantly changing, and that is going to be radius. So this is more or less the diameter. In fact, maybe diameter is more appropriate, but it's basically the size of vessel lumen. This is the main variable that is responsible for resistance, the radius. And because that's constantly changing due to various factors such as sympathetic innervation and parasympathetic innervation. So the greater the radius, the less the resistance. Larger things are easier to travel through. And the greater the flow. And the inverse is also true. The smaller the radius, the greater the resistance, and the less the flow. This explains why in the sympathetic system, why is it that when beta 2 receptors cause vasodilation, why is it important that in other parts of the body there's vasoconstriction? What you do is that you decrease the radius of vessels going to several non-essential systems like the digestive system and the urinary system, but you dilate the arterioles going to the muscle. Blood, like anything else, likes to travel to the area of least resistance. Blood is more likely to go to skeletal muscle than through the vessels leading to other parts of the body. So this is a factor that is always occurring. Factor that mainly is responsible for resistance is going to be vessel radius. All right, everyone. So we are on to another contraction pathway. This is our last one. It's going to be the cardiac cycle. And keep in mind on the exam, I'm going to ask you a lot about comparing and contrasting the three types of contraction pathways. So let's just go and jump right into the cardiac muscle contraction. And one thing to know is that muscle just responds to signals in the form of, well, electricity. And we know that in skeletal muscle, you are going to have acetylcholine bind with nicotinic receptors, and that, of course, is going to depolarize the muscle cell. With cardiac muscle, it's a bit different because the depolarization wave begins in what's called the pacemaker cells. Then the impulse is going to travel down the cardiac muscle fibers and into adjacent ones through these things called intercalated discs, which are gap junctions. So what's going to happen is that step one is that the action potential is going to travel down the membrane of the adjacent cardiac cell, which in this case would be the one in pink here. And when it goes down, it is going to open a voltage-gated calcium channel. So step one on the outline is that the action potential is going to travel down or through the intercalated disc, and then it is going to open up this calcium channel here. Now when this happens, a couple things are going to occur. The first is that extracellular calcium, which I'll draw here. Remember that calcium is ubiquitous throughout the body. Extracellular calcium is going to diffuse in, and this extracellular calcium is going to open this channel here on the SR called RYR. You might remember that from the skeletal muscle contraction pathway. So I'm going to erase RYR, and it's going to open back up now, like so. Now when this happens is that you are going to have calcium passively diffuse out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now when this occurs, the combination of the calcium influxing from outside the cell and the calcium released from the SR, you're going to see something appear called a calcium spark that appears on very powerful microscopes. Now what's going to happen is something very similar. Calcium is going to bind to troponin, and it's going to shift away tropomyosin. Let me go ahead and shift away the tropomyosin to expose the actin myosin head binding sites. So tropomyosin is going to be shifted away, and you are going to have contraction. Much like the other pathways, you need a process of termination. There's a couple of ways to terminate it. One is that you are going to actively pump back calcium through a calcium pump. Let's go ahead and do this in brown. So say that brown is a Ca2+ pump. So one method of termination is actively pumping calcium back into the SR. However, to keep things balanced, you also want to return calcium to the outside environment. So we have here something called an NCX channel, which I'll label here, NCX. What it's going to do is it is going to remove sodium. Go ahead and do sodium and teal. It is going to, sorry, it is going to, let me double check my notes. So what's going to happen is that sodium is going to be exchanged for calcium. So Na plus is going to leave the cell, is going to enter the cell, apologies. And then calcium is going to leave the cell, like so. Actually, why does that not seem right? Let me double check. Let me double check my notes here. Yeah, no, it's right. I'm just doubting myself. Bad habit, or good habit, depends on how you view it. So sodium is going to enter the cell, and calcium is going to leave it to make sure that we have plenty of calcium in the extracellular environment for the next contraction. Meanwhile, we don't want sodium to build up in the cell either. So that's why we have the sodium-potassium antiporter that is going to remove sodium from the cell and exchange it for potassium. And I don't have potassium on here either, so we'll do orange is going to be potassium. And that's another way of termination, is we want to make sure that there's plenty of calcium returned to the extracellular environment so we can have enough extracellular calcium for the next contraction. So let's go ahead and review this again. An action potential is generated from the pacemaker cells and rapidly travels through the adjacent muscle fibers because the muscle fibers are linked with gap junctions, which show up on a light microscope as intercalated discs. As the action potential travels through the muscle fiber, it's going to go down a T tubule. It's going to open a voltage-gated calcium channel. An extracellular calcium is going to enter this voltage-gated calcium channel, and it is going to open up the channel on the SR called RYR. The signal for opening up RYR is going to be extracellular calcium. Once this door is open, so to speak, calcium is going to diffuse out of the SR. So the combination of extracellular calcium and intracellular calcium is going to cause what's called a calcium spark to appear. By this point, calcium is going to bind with troponin, shift tropomyosin, and begin a contraction. To terminate the contraction, you're going to actively move the calcium back into the SR. It is going to move into the SR through the law of mass action that I told you about earlier. And then you are going to have calcium return to the extracellular environment through the NCX pump. Brings out calcium, brings in sodium. And we also have the sodium-potassium pump, which is going to bring out sodium and bring in potassium. And that's how you ensure that there is plenty of extracellular calcium and that the intracellular calcium is restored as well. And then the cardiac cell is ready for the next depolarization event, so your heart can contract once again. All right, everyone. Well, we are back with the cardiac cycle. Always an exciting time. Let's go ahead and first talk about what the cardiac cycle is. The cardiac cycle are the mechanical events that happen during one contraction cycle, hence cardiac cycle. And we're going to talk about some neat things involving that. It's diagram 14.18 in your book. So first, let's go ahead and clarify, and I have this on the outline, systole and diastole. Systole is when the heart is actively contracting. Diastole is during periods where the heart is not contracting. So we're going to start with, and keep in mind the cycle is a continuous thing. You can pick any point on the cycle and start there. I'm going to start with what's called late diastole. Let's go ahead and delineate that. So late diastole. So Here we're going to draw the heart again. So we have the ventricles, the myocardium. Now the valves. Well, keep in mind that the semilunar valves, their baseline is going to be closed. So both the aortic valve as well as the pulmonary valve are going to be closed. So just go ahead and draw this really quick. I'm just going to draw one pulmonary artery. And then the vena cava, draw that really quick. Now, one thing I do want you to see, though, is that the atrioventricular valves are open. So let me draw the vena cava, radical. All right, so let's go ahead and see what's going on here. So this is late diastole, which means that we're right about to start a new cycle. And I know this is not the best drawing in the world, but bear with me. So first of all, let's talk about the heart muscle itself. The atria are in a state of being relaxed. So it is in a relaxed state. That just means it is not contracting. The ventricles are also relaxed. Makes sense, right? If the heart is in diastole, it means it is not contracting. Thus, the ventricles would not be contracting. Now, the atrioventricular valves, also nicknamed the AV valves, they are open. Because recall that their baseline form is that they are open. So this is going to be the appearance of the atrioventricular valves. So we see that they are open. What that means is that blood can passively go down the atria into the ventricles, which goes against what many people commonly think, is that the atria must contract in order to get the blood into the ventricles. That's not true. The atria contracting is not a requirement for blood to be pumped throughout the body, but it certainly helps. It certainly is a necessity for proper function, but it doesn't have to happen. We'll talk about why in a bit. So the atrioventricular valves are open. Semilunar valves, as we talked about, are closed. So what this means is that blood is entering the heart and going down like this. And go ahead and do blue. So this is called late diastole. Okay, so now what we are going to do, I'm going to go ahead and clear this because I'm just not happy with the heart drawing. So now we're on step 2, which is atrial systole. And it's going to look like this. So once again, we have the ventricle chambers, myocardium. Then we are going to draw the semilunar valves, and guess what? They are still closed. Nothing has changed there. Aorta, pulmonary arteries. All right. And let's go ahead. So one pulmonary artery. The atrioventricular valves are still open, so don't worry about that. And then we have the vena cava. And yeah, all right, so now we're ready to rock. So now this is atriosystole. So a couple things have changed since our last diagram. For starters, the atria are now in a state of contraction. Now, when the atria contracts, what it's doing is it is squeezing the blood that has remained in the atria, is squeezing it into the ventricle. Most of the blood is going to passively move into the ventricles. The atria contracts just to make sure that the maximum amount of blood gets into the ventricles before they contract. So as I said, it is not a mandate. It does not have to happen for blood to be pumped throughout the body, but it certainly is a requirement for proper cardiac function. Okay, so the atria is going to contract. The ventricles, they are still relaxed. So ventricular contraction is the major event that pumps blood throughout the body. The AV valves are still open. They are still open, and the SL valves are still shut because, as we talked about before, the SL valves only open when they are forced open. So what's going to happen here, and I'm going to show you, is that blood has entered the pulmonary veins, and now that the atria has contracted, the maximum amount of blood is now in the ventricles. Now we measure that volume. We have a name for it. So this is the stage where we have what's called end diastolic volume, also known as EDV. EDV. So what this is blood volume in ventricles before contraction. We'll talk about the significance of this in a bit. So the amount of blood in the ventricles at the end of atriosystole is going to be end diastolic volume. That's where you would measure that. All right, here's a mouthful. 3. Isovalvumic ventricular contraction. Yep, that is a long one, isn't it? So let's kind of break this down a bit. Iso means still. Volume means amount of liquid in a container. So iso, the same volume, but the ventricles are contracting. Well, that is kind of a paradox, isn't it? So let's go ahead and draw this and let's see what's happening. I think we need a nicer color for the heart, brown, nice rich brown color, like color of dirt after a nice rainfall. All right, so once again, now the SL valves, guess what? They're still closed. Nothing has changed there. And let's call the pulmonary arteries. The AV valves, though, something's going to change here. The AV valves are going to be closed now, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So now the AV valves are closed. Draw one pulmonary artery. And now let's go ahead and draw the vena cava. Going to be cut at the top here. Okay, so as I said, the AV valves are now closed. Blood is still going to be contained in the ventricles. But what has changed is that now the heart is in a state of contraction, but the volume has not changed, and I'll show you why. So what has happened is that the AV valves, they started off like this, but the one thing to keep in mind is that the heart contracts from the bottom up. It contracts like this. It squeezes the blood from the bottom up, and that's going to force the blood through these semilunar valves. Please recall that the SL valves, their baseline is this. And it's like this because there's a bunch of blood sitting on top. It's like trying to open up a submarine hatch when you're in the submarine, but someone's sitting on top of it. I'm sure that's a relatable analogy for everyone. So what's going to happen here is that the AV valves, since valves, the definition of a valve is something that ensures one-way flow, what's going to happen is that when the ventricles contract, blood is going to be forced up the ventricles back into the atria. We don't want that, because the whole idea with isovolumic ventricular contraction is you're building enough pressure to open up the semilunar valves and force blood into the aorta and pulmonary artery. If you don't have necessary force, you can't do that. In order to create that force, you need to generate pressure. To generate pressure, you need a closed container. What's going to happen here is that when blood is forced up the ventricles back into the atrium, what's going to happen is these valves are going to close like this. This is what happens when blood is going to be pushed against them. They're going to close, just like this. And they're going to form an impenetrable barrier. So blood's not going to be able to get through. So let's kind of go through what's happening here. So the atria, their job is done. They are relaxed. The ventricles, they are in a state of contracting. They're contracting, but they haven't contracted quite hard enough to force blood through the SL valves. The AV valves are closed. I'm just going to write AV. They're closed. And SL is going to be opened. Sorry, closed still. So really, the only thing that has changed is the ventricles are contracting and the AV valves have been slammed shut. At the end of this stage, you are going to hear a sound called lub. So this is the stage where the lub sound is heard. That is the sound of the AV valves closing. So we have the myocardium and the ventricles contracting. So they're contracting, but they haven't generated enough force yet to open up the SL valves. What has happened though is that the AV valves have been slammed shut. And what that is going to do is it is going to generate pressure. And that's where we're at now. Oh, so guess what? We are at ventricular ejection. And I'm going to be a little bit selfish here, and I'm just going to keep the same diagram, but now I'm going to just add to it because, yes. Okay, so now this is stage 4, and this is going to be ventricular ejection. If I can spell ventricular ejection. All right, so let's kind of talk about what has happened here. So now the SL valves are going to be open. So let me kind of show you what's happening here. Is now blood, due to the pressure generated in the last stage, now will be enough to force open the SL valves and eject blood into the valves. And it's pretty amazing that this happens about a little bit more than once per second. But blood is going to be ejected into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, and it does so by forcing open the SL valves. And then what's going to happen is that when the ventricles are done contracting, you're going to hear another sound called dub. And this is the sound of the SL valves closing. Now, this is also the stage where you are going to record a value called end systolic volume. Very important value here. End systolic volume. And this is amount of blood in ventricles after contraction. And this one is very important because it's how we measure stroke volume. So EDV minus ESV equals SV for stroke volume. Now, you want this number to be on the higher side, because if you have a high end diastolic volume and a low end systolic volume, like I'm just going to say arbitrary value, 20 milliliters minus 0.5 milliliters equals 19.5 milliliters. So what this means is that your heart is doing a very good job of injecting almost all the blood in the ventricles into the arteries. However, if this number is smaller, that means that more of the blood is remaining in the ventricles, and that can lead to a problem with the heart itself. So you want the number to be on the higher side. All right. And now the next stage, and as I said, I'm going to be a little bit selfish here. And now we are back to sort of a similar version to the first stage. And this is going to be what we call isovolumic ventricular relaxation. This is like the vacation stage of the heart. I'm going to stick with our nice brown color. So the heart has done all this really hard work. And now what's going to happen is that blood is once again going to enter through the pulmonary veins and the vena cava. Going to start to passively fill the atria again. So this stage is very similar to stage number 1, as you can probably tell. So the atria are relaxed, the ventricles are relaxed, the AV valves are going to be open, and the SL valves are going to be closed. So we're pretty much back to stage 1 here. And these are the events of the cardiac cycle. So stroke volume, as I said, is EDV minus ESV. Very important value. Cardiac output, which is more or less the volume of blood ejected per minute. And the formula for that is going to be CO equals SV times HR. HR is heart rate. You won't be asked to do any calculations, but you will need to know the formula. All right, next up is going to be ECGs. All right, everyone. Last part of the cardiac cycle lecture. We're going to talk about the electrical events of an ECG, electrocardiogram. Some of you may know it as EKG. That's what it's called in Germany, because cardiac is spelled with a K. But I guess the proper English British term is ECG, electrocardiogram. And what this does is it sets up a series of what we call leads, and it measures which direction the electrical impulse is traveling, and it displays that on the graph. If things go wrong with this graph, then it can lead to the diagnoses of certain issues. So the first thing that happens is, as we know, we have pacemaker cells. And these pacemaker cells are going to generate an impulse. But we actually have quite a few areas of pacemaker cells. So the preferred one is what's called the sinoatrial node, also known as the SA node. This is your main pacemaker. But if something goes wrong, we have a backup node called the AV valve, or atrioventricular node. I said valve, it's node. And we have another series of conducting fibers. These are actually called the bundle of His. Sounds like an Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the bundle of His. Then finally we have the Purkinje fibers. All of these can function as pacemakers, but they don't do it nearly as well as the SA node. These conducting fibers are going to be responsible for depolarizing aspects of the heart. And the impulse is going to start in the SA node. It's going to be in the atrial region. Impulse is going to begin here, and it is going to move down to the atrioventricular node, which is right above a lot of really dense tissue. Now on the EKG, it's going to show up as what we call a P wave. I'll title this as P. Now you're going to see a segment where there looks like there's nothing happening. We call this the PR segment. And what's happening here is that, as I said, there's a lot of fibrous tissue in the atrioventricular region. And it's going to take a while for the impulse to collect here and then move down the bundle of His. So that pause here is what we call the PR segment. Now what we have next is going to be what's called a QRS wave, and this is going to be ventricular depolarization. So we have QRS. What's going to happen here is that the impulse is going to move down the bundle of His. Then it's going to turn and it's going to run through the ventricles from the bottom up through the Purkinje fibers. Now, it's going to look like this. Well, I already drew it on the graph. QRS. Draw the Q a bit bigger. That's how ventricular depolarization is going to look on the ECG. Now we have another segment here called the ST segment. ST segment. And this is going to be the time between ventricular depolarization and this other part, ventricular repolarization, which shows up as a T. Students ask me, where on the graph is atrial repolarization? The answer is somewhere in this region here. It just is overshadowed by the QRS complex. All right, so let's go through this once again. The impulse begins at the sinoatrial node, and it's going to travel from the SA node to the AV node. It's going to show up as a P wave. The PR segment is a slight pause as the impulse is going to collect over the bundle of His. It takes a little time because there's some really fibrous tissue here. As it moves down the bundle of His, then up the ventricles, that's going to show up as the QRS wave. And then the small pause, the ST segment, is going to be ventricular repolarization, which does show up on the ECG as a wave. Of course, there's a couple of disorders that can happen. One is going to be called atrial fibrillation. Something has happened to the heart and it has messed up the rhythm. You are going to have it have random impulses everywhere. So this is going to be in the atria though, atria fibrillation, and it's going to look like this. It's also known as AFib. So you see the P wave is rather erratic, and you're going to have a slightly different, sorry, it's going to be a little bit erratic. You're going to have a modified looking QRS wave, then you're going to have a fairly normal T wave. So it's more or less the absence of the P wave because the atria are kind of going like this. So they're not really contracting. You still will have blood pressure with this, but it will be clear that there's something wrong. Other things that can happen, and this is a lot more serious, is ventricular fibrillation. And it's going to be really bad because it's going to result in the absence of blood pressure. Patient will eventually be unconscious. This is going to be random impulses on the graph. So this is called ventricular fibrillation. Now, this results in the absence of blood pressure. Because in order, as we talked about with the cardiac cycle, in order for blood to be pumped throughout the body, the ventricles need to contract in coordination, as we just talked about, and it needs to be able to force blood through the SL valves, and it can do so by violently contracting like this. Notice how it's going from the bottom up. However, with ventricular fibrillation, is the impulses are happening sporadically. You have something like this. And that's not going to get the job done. That's not going to generate enough force to get the blood through the SL valves. We call this here, we call this coarse fibrillation. Over time, though, it's going to get thinner and thinner, or smaller and smaller, and it's going to become fine fibrillation. And eventually, if something is not done, then it is going to become finer and finer until you reach a stage called asystole. Asystole is the absence of electrical activity in the heart. So it's going to look like this. It's going to be the flat line that you see on TV. We call this asystole, the absence of systolic activity. Asystole is more or less death. Very few doctors have ever brought a patient back from asystole. Grateful to have had the opportunity to talk to some very smart doctors throughout the years, and one doctor I talked to said he's never brought a patient back from asystole. He did bring back one, but he thinks that the patient was probably in very fine ventricular fibrillation. And asystole is, unfortunately, everyone that is passed away is an asystole. And this means that the individual, as I said, probably is not going to be brought back. Now, when somebody has a disordered rhythm of the heart, normally a machine is called is used called a defibrillator, which means it takes away fibrillation. And you really want to make sure, I'm sure that a lot of EMTs maybe will back me up on this. I've never done it myself, so I can't really say with utmost certainty. Probably want to make sure the patient is unconscious for this part, because there's a lot of electricity moving through their body and probably is not very pleasant. I think it's something like 2,000 volts. But the idea is to get the heart back into normal rhythm. You see on TV a lot that somebody flatlines and then they're magically brought back with a defibrillator. When someone's in asystole, there's nothing to defibrillate. You want to keep activity going by um, giving the individual epinephrine to encourage their heart to still have activity. There's something else that's weird called pulseless electrical activity. This means that the ECG is showing normal electrical activity, but the patient does not have a pulse, which also shows you the folly of a machine. Machines are diagnostic tools, but they don't replace your ability to accurately diagnose. As you see with pulseless electrical activity, it's very similar to what you would see on a normal ECG with the absence of a pulse. Normally this happens with extreme trauma where the patient is bleeding out, as in their blood volume is extremely low. It's too low in order to pump throughout the body. So one of my EMT students last year told me a story that a young woman was hit by a truck going about 70 miles an hour. And she was in shock, but she was still conscious at the time when they got there. And they hooked her up to an ECG and found that she had normal electrical activity, but eventually her pulse stopped and she unfortunately did not survive. But you had this person who was still conscious, unfortunately, but internally there was too much damage done. So that, he said, was the only example he's seen of pulseless electrical activity. But I know we have some EMTs in this class, and perhaps they can chime in and let us know if they've ever seen it. All right, this concludes chapter 14.